Have you ever wondered what happens when the mind of a king, the very symbol of an empire's stability, begins to crumble from within? Not by enemy swords, not by palace politics, but by an invisible invader, a specter that creeps into every corner of consciousness, turning the inner kingdom into a desolate battlefield. This is no fairy tale. This is the forgotten tragedy of the last king of the United States and the first king of a united Britain, George III. In 1788, the British Empire was at the height of its power. Its colonies spanned the globe. Its navy was a terror on the seas. And on the throne sat an unusual monarch. Unlike his German predecessors, George III was born in England, spoke English without a trace of foreign accent, and proudly declared, "I am proud to bear the name of an Englishman." He was a symbol of stability, a faithful husband, devoted to Queen Charlotte, a father of 15 children. He was not to be found in lavish parties, but in his study with its thousands of books, in the observatory he had built himself, or in the fields where he was so absorbed in agriculture that he was affectionately nicknamed Farmer George. He patronized the arts, founded the Royal Academy, and was a talented flutist. He was a king of the Enlightenment, rational, exemplary, and as solid as the Rock of Gibraltar. But then, that fateful summer, the first crack appeared in the perfect wall. It began in a trivial way, a stomachache. The royal physicians diagnosed gallstones and sent the king to the resort of Cheltenham to recuperate. But the physical ailment seemed to be only a prelude to a more terrifying symphony. At Cheltenham, the king began to change. His energy was unusually explosive. He talked endlessly for hours on end, jumping from topic to topic at a speed that no one could keep up with. His eyes gleamed with a disturbing fervor. His attendants began to whisper about his strange behavior. The king would wake up in the middle of the night, insist on walking in the rain, and utter profanities and obscenities that would have been unthinkable from a man so devout. By the time he returned to Windsor Castle, the specter of illness had fully materialized. His physical pain was accompanied by strange symptoms, swellings, rashes, and his urine, which was reportedly blue or purple, a haunting detail that historians have struggled to decipher for centuries. But it was the breakdown of his mind that horrified the kingdom. The exemplary monarch could now run naked through the palace corridors, hurl insults at those he loved most, and in a fit of madness, attack his own son, the Prince of Wales. The kingdom was in chaos. The king, who was considered God's chosen one, now behaved like a demon-possessed beast. London's best doctors were helpless. They administered ice baths, bloodletting, purgatives, all to no avail. The disease seemed to defy all medical efforts. Despair gripped the royal family and the government. They needed a solution, a miracle, someone bold enough to confront the king's madness. Little did they know, the answer they were about to find was even more terrifying than the disease, and it had a name: Dr. Francis Willis. When orthodox medicine bowed its head in defeat, and Enlightenment reason failed before primal chaos, where did people turn? They did not turn to the divine. They turned to a form of earthly power more terrifying than the disease itself. In December 1788, a carriage pulled up outside Windsor Palace, and out stepped a man who would forever change the king's fate. He was not a renowned London physician. He was Francis Willis, a former clergyman who had turned to running a private asylum in rural Lincolnshire. Willis did not bring complex medical theories. He brought a simple but brutal philosophy, something he called the moral method. It sounded benevolent, but at its core was a brutal psychological struggle. To cure the madman, his will had to be completely broken. Madness, Willis believed, was a form of rebellion, and the only way to restore order was through absolute submission. He saw the king not as a patient to be cured, but as an enemy to be conquered. And the battlefield was the mind of George III. Willis immediately established an iron rule within the palace itself. The king, who had once commanded an empire, was stripped of all discretion. The windows in his chambers were nailed shut. Wooden spoons were replaced with knives and forks. He was separated from Queen Charlotte and his children, whose presence, Willis said, only incited his madness. His physician and his courtiers, large men with expressionless faces, became the king's new jailers. And then the cure rituals began. They were systematically staged nightmares. When a king was hysterical, he would be tied into a straitjacket, the rough fabric squeezing his body, making the supreme monarch a helpless prisoner in his own flesh. To draw the poison from his brain, the king's head was shaved and covered with a mustard-based ointment that caused painful blisters as if a halo of fire were burning his scalp. More than 2,000 times over 6 months, his body was forcibly purged with purgatives. His blood was regularly drained, draining his last strength. But the most terrifying weapon in Willis's arsenal was something called the emetic, a compound containing tartar emetic. This white powder, when mixed with food and drink, brought on violent bouts of vomiting and diarrhea. It was a poison in disguise, a dose of arsenic. Each spoonful Willis gave the king was not a cure, but a slow kiss of death, a poison that would slowly eat away at his nervous system for years to come. And the pinnacle of this medical torture was the coronation chair. It was not the ornate throne at Westminster. It was a specially designed chair designed by Willis, with leather straps and iron buckles, capable of binding the king from neck to toe, keeping him completely immobile for hours. Confined to this throne of agony, facing a blank wall, the king had no choice but to confront his ultimate helplessness. Willis called it contemplation. History calls it torture. Gradually, the screams died down. The resistance weakened. The proud king began to obey. To the astonishment of the court, George III seemed to recover. He became calm, spoke clearly. A miracle had happened. Dr. Willis was hailed as a savior. But in the king's terrifying silence, a haunting question echoed that no one dared to ask. Was the king cured, or had he simply learned to wear a new mask, a mask of sanity carved from utter terror? Silence is not always a sign of peace. Sometimes it is the stillness of a battlefield after a massacre, where one side has been utterly crushed. In the spring of 1789, London celebrated. The king had recovered. Church bells rang. Thanksgiving services were held. The king appeared before the public, thin, pale, but alert. He smiled and waved, and the empire breathed a sigh of relief. Dr. Francis Willis was hailed as a national hero, rewarded with a huge fortune and the highest honors. He had done the impossible, subdued the king's madness. But in the private corridors of the palace, Queen Charlotte, the woman who loved and understood her husband better than anyone else, sensed a disturbing truth. George was back, but he was not the man she had known. The warmth, the subtle humor, and the intellectual light in his eyes had been replaced by a reserve, a distant sadness, and an unspoken fear. He obeyed every rule, but like a child who had been punished beyond reason. His mind was like a precious harpsichord that had been repaired by a clumsy craftsman with hammer and pliers. It could make sounds, but the beautiful melodies were lost forever. Arsenic still coursed through his veins, and the horrible memories of the straitjacket and the torture chair had carved invisible scars into his soul. And then the inevitable happened. The recovery was a fragile illusion. In 1801, the ghost returned. This time, it was more cruel because it was now fed not only by the disease but also by the trauma. The old symptoms returned: sleepless nights, long monologues, sudden rages. But now his madness took the form of his jailers. He screamed in terror at the sight of anyone dressed in black like a doctor, and he had convulsions at the sound of a key in a lock. The Willis family was called again, but now the cure of the king had become a family business. Francis Willis's sons took over, and their methods became even more mechanical and brutal. They were no longer trying to cure a disease. They were simply managing a problem. The straitjacket was used more frequently. The torture chair became a daily deterrent. For George, every day he woke up was a gamble. Would he be king, or would he be a prisoner? Queen Charlotte lived in constant terror. She realized that her husband had fallen into a perfect trap. His madness led to torture, and torture made his madness worse. It was a vicious cycle with no escape. Her love had turned to fear. She installed complex systems of doors and locks to protect herself and her daughters from the king's increasingly violent sexual attacks. The palace, once a warm home, was now a lavish prison where everyone was a prisoner of the royal tragedy. The king was isolated, poisoned by those who were paid to treat him, and shunned by those he loved. He was sinking into darkness, but fate had not yet let him go. The greatest tragedy of George III's life came not from the torture chair or the poison, but from a whisper at the bedside of his favorite daughter. An empire can endure a mad king, but how much can a father endure the loss of his most beloved child? Of his 15 children, Princess Amelia, the frail youngest, was the light in George III's otherwise dark life. He called her affectionately Emily, and his love for her was one of his last ties to reality. But that tie was fragile. Amelia contracted tuberculosis, and throughout 1810 the king spent hours every day by her bedside, watching his beloved daughter slowly wither away. His helplessness was greater than the pain of an empire. One October afternoon, Amelia, with the last of her strength, gave her father a ring. Inside was a lock of her hair, and on it was engraved the words, "Remember me." In that moment, that little ring became heavier than the crown. It was a symbol of all that he had lost and was about to lose. A few days later, Princess Amelia died, and with her last breath, King George III's mind was shattered into pieces. It was not a loud madness like before. It was a collapse from within, quiet and absolute. The string had broken. The king no longer screamed or struggled. He had simply left this world, though his heart still beat. He began to speak to people who did not exist. He spent hours talking to his long-lost children, and most of all, he always saw Amelia by his side. The pain was so great that his mind had to create a new reality, one where his daughter had never left. The kingdom could wait no longer. In 1811, the Regency Act was passed, officially declaring the king incompetent to rule. His eldest son, the Prince of Wales, took over as Prince Regent. To the outside world, George III's reign was over. He became a ghost imprisoned in his own palace. The last 10 years of his life were a picture of neglect and decay. He was confined to a suite of rooms at Windsor Castle, cut off from the world. Illness and decades of arsenic poisoning had robbed him of his sight. He was completely blind. His hearing had also deteriorated, plunging him deeper into an inner world of darkness and silence. His beard had grown long and white. His fingernails, uncut, grew claw-like. The king, once known as Farmer George, was now a haggard figure, a ghost in filthy clothes, force-fed by servants. But in his own shadowy kingdom, he was still king. He sat at his harpsichord for hours, playing Handel to an imaginary court. Sometimes he believed he was leading armies against Napoleon, unaware that the war had long since ended and Wellington had become a national hero. Sometimes he held solemn conversations with angels. In one of his most painful visions, he believed he was marrying Princess Amelia herself, a desperate attempt by his mind to rewrite the tragedy. In 1818, Queen Charlotte, his companion of more than 50 turbulent years, died. He did not know. He still asked the servants about her, as if she were in the next room. He was all but forgotten by the world he once ruled. On a cold January day in 1820, the last of the harps fell silent. But was the silence of death truly the end, or did it merely open a final chapter, one written not in ink, but in forensic science and the secrets hidden in the king's own hair? For 2 centuries, history has closed the case against George III with a simple verdict: the mad king who lost America and ruined himself. His story has become a cautionary tale, a caricature of the folly of power. He is remembered for plays and films that portray the king as a ridiculous, pathetic clown on the stage of his own tragedy. But history, like memory, sometimes hides the truth in the most unlikely places. And in the case of George III, the truth was sealed inside his own body. Time passed. The British Empire changed. The world entered the era of science and technology. And at the beginning of the 21st century, nearly 200 years after the king's death, scientists decided to reopen the coldest case of the British royal family. They searched not in dusty archives, but in a sterile laboratory. Their evidence was not old letters, but a lock of the king's hair, cut off in a fit of madness and kept for generations. Under electron microscopes and mass spectrometers, the white hairs began to tell a horrifying story. Scientists at the London Science Centre had discovered a long-buried secret. The concentration of arsenic in the king's hair was hundreds of times higher than normal. It was a lethal dose, enough to cause permanent neurological damage, paranoia, hallucinations, and physical weakness. The source of the poison? None other than the vomit that Dr. Willis and his family had been forcing the king to drink daily for years. Their cure was, in fact, a slow, systematic process of poisoning. The king's madness was more than a disease. It had been amplified, nurtured, and turned into a permanent nightmare by the poisons in the name of medicine. But that wasn't all. A few years later, another analysis, this time of language, dealt the final blow to the Mad King myth. Using computer algorithms to analyze thousands of George III's handwritten letters, linguists found a clear pattern. During his normal periods, his writing was exemplary and precise. But during his supposedly mad periods, his sentences became longer and more complex, his vocabulary bursting with creative metaphors and complex sentence structures. These were not signs of mental confusion. These were the classic linguistic features of a manic state, the peak phase of type 1 bipolar disorder. The truth has finally come out. George III was not crazy. He suffered from a mental illness that is now completely manageable with medication. His tragedy was not that he was born crazy, but that he suffered from an illness that no one understood and was then treated with torture and poisoned by arrogant men who turned his suffering into profit and glory. The story of George III is no longer that of a mad king. It becomes a stark indictment of cruelty disguised as medical ethics, a lesson in the dangers of stripping patients of their dignity. He is not a beast to be tamed, but a man in pain, a father, a husband, an intellectual caught in a perfect storm of illness and abuse. History has called him the Mad King. But perhaps a more accurate title would be the Tortured King, a tragedy not just about a fallen king, but about an era that mistook cruelty for healing, and about a truth that had to wait 200 years in the dark to finally come to light.